I truly do not believe that there is an 80s horror franchise that is as polarizing as the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Sure, Halloween is iconic because it jump-started the genre, and Friday the 13th was the one to popularize a series franchising itself into the ground, but A Nightmare on Elm Street was just a piece of cinema magic. I'm not the first person to say this, but A Nightmare on Elm Street and its sequels are some of the most imaginative and creative horror movies ever made. A few years ago, I did review Freddy's Dead, and with that, I did do a brief overview of the rest of the series, but that was early in my YouTube video career, and I'm not really happy with how I went about that review, so maybe one day I'll recut it or I'll redo it entirely. So going into this review, throw most of what I said out. A Nightmare on Elm Street was a concept from horror icon Wes Craven, and he was inspired by a few different elements. The name Freddy comes from a kid named Freddy who picked on him when he was a kid. Freddy Krueger's appearance is based on an incident where a crazed hobo threatened him in front of his house when he was younger, and the concept of kids dying in their sleep is based on a story he read in the newspaper about some Cambodian kids.
Laos, stupid! It's a landlocked country in Southeast Asia. It's between Vietnam and Thailand, okay?
Who were having horrible nightmares and refusing to sleep and later died from heart attacks. A Nightmare on Elm Street went through quite a few different studios before it was picked up. Disney wanted it, but they wanted to make it more of a family-friendly horror movie, which Wes Craven was not receptive to. Eventually, the project ended up at upstart production company New Line Cinema, and it would pretty much be the defining franchise that put New Line on the map. The success of A Nightmare on Elm Street would lead New Line Cinema to being referred to as the house that Freddy built. Slasher movies in the 80s were plentiful, but many of them were just the same formula. Big unstoppable killer stabs and hacks teenagers apart in one of a few settings. What Nightmare on Elm Street did was similar to what movies like Alien did. It took the basic premise of a slasher film, but added a unique twist to it. And yes, Alien at its core is just a slasher movie in space. And A Nightmare on Elm Street is a slasher movie that uses supernatural and interdimensional elements. As rather than stalking teenagers in a suburb or in the woods, the killer is getting them in there. The movie starts off in a pretty jarring way. It makes you uneasy right from the get-go. All you see is just some guy constructing some sort of glove with blades on it and heavily breathing, and then as soon as the synth drops, he screams like a maniac. And then you're just right in the middle of somebody's nightmare, which is extremely surreal but captures the randomness of dreams, where yes, a lamb would just show up out of nowhere, and yes, the furnace would be making a horrid combination of sounds. This is what the kids on TV tropes would refer to as literal nightmare fuel, because as the character of Tina would find out, the whole thing took place in a nightmare. And it is now time for some obligatory Canadian content. So, I always remember hearing this dumb little urban legend that the opening dream sequence with the Tina character wasn't shot in California with the rest of the movie. There was a rumor that the opening scene from this movie was shot in Toronto, using Lower Queens Station as the shooting location. And yes, it would be incredibly stupid for a movie that was shot entirely in California to come up to Toronto to shoot one scene. A brief history lesson: back in the day, before we had the above-ground Queen streetcar, they were going to construct a below-ground transit under Queen Street. Lower Queen was supposed to be the loop and platform for the streetcar to kind of loop around underground, but then they changed their mind, they didn't end up using it. So there's like a half-ass constructed little transit area just below what would become Queen subway station later on. The problem with this urban legend is that they don't open Lower Queen to anybody. There is Lower Bay Station at the Bloor Danforth Line's Bay Station, which has been open to the public for parties and has been used for shooting, but Lower Queen is off limits. I don't know where this dumb urban legend started, but I went on Twitter and asked the actress who played Tina, Amanda Wyss, about it, and she confirmed that it is in fact a stupid urban legend. I don't know why certain cities do this. Maybe it's just to, like, you know, make things more interesting, like, oh yeah, you know, they shot that Nightmare on Elm Street movie here, but no, it was a dumb urban legend, wasn't true, so I just wasted about a minute and 25 seconds of your time. A Nightmare on Elm Street features a small cast of characters who are all very well played and hit those horror tropes. You got Heather Langenkamp as Nancy, the dark-haired, kinda nerdy girl who's friends with Tina, the blonde girl who is dating Rod, the jerky greaser, and then there's Johnny Depp in his first role as Nancy's boyfriend, Glenn. The teenage characters are supplemented by Nancy's parents, her father being played by John Saxon, and her mother being played by Ronnie Blakely. The first little portion of the movie puts emphasis on the Tina character, as she is what Hollywood at the time would have typically made a leading lady. She's blonde and she's pretty, and it's implied that she's been the victim of these nightmares for quite a bit of time leading up to the start of the film. But Tina would find out that Nancy is having similar nightmares to her, and it's shocking to find out that they're having the exact same nightmares. And then during a sleepover, Tina gets horribly killed in what is genuinely an unsettling nightmare sequence.
Please, God.
This is God.
I think the way they shot the nightmare is definitely creepy, but whenever I see Freddy with the fucking long arms, I just think it's like a bizarre choice, and it kind of makes me laugh. Besides that, the whole thing is intense, and it's fast, and it's dark, so you don't really get to see what's going on, but you know it isn't good. And since they pretty much made it seem like Tina would be the lead of the movie, it comes as a pretty big shock that she just gets brutally murdered within the first 20 minutes of the film. Like, not knowing exactly what Freddy is doing to her makes it creepier, and then she just starts fucking bleeding everywhere. This is a really cool death scene. They accomplished it by just building an upside down room and filming from the ceiling, but I gotta say, this is a pretty solid death scene for an early slasher film. And if it wasn't for a much later death scene, it would probably be the best death scene in the movie. When you look at this scene and you put yourself in Rod, Tina's boyfriend's shoes, it's pretty horrifying secondhand. You got this chick that you were just fucking banging, and now she's flopping around the ceiling, screaming and bleeding like a stuck pig. And then the reality sets in once it's all over that even though you didn't do it, you're likely going to take the blame for this because whatever did it was invisible. And that's exactly what happens. He ends up getting arrested, but Nancy knows that Rod didn't do it, and despite initial doubts, she becomes certain that this has something to do with the man in her dreams. But of course, Rod being the killer is the most logical conclusion, and her conclusion, true as it may be, sounds absolutely outrageous. The movie itself plays on the common fear of nobody believing the kid when the kid is right, an old but reliable trope. So now that Tina is out of the picture, the film shifts focus and Nancy becomes the lead character, as well as the victim of the burned man in her dreams, which, yeah, we know now that he's Freddy Krueger. But at this point in time, the series was new, so they tried to add a bit of a mystery element to the happenings within. So we don't know who Freddy is yet. We just know that he killed Tina, and now he's coming after Nancy, too. I think one of my favorite all-time scenes in the entire Nightmare on Elm Street franchise is Nancy's first nightmare sequence. It's creepy, it's uncanny, but it's also very dreamlike. How she just up and sees Tina in a bloody body bag in the middle of school, and since she's in a dream, decides to just go along with it. And she follows it as it's being dragged through the hallway. A word of advice from me, somebody who had nightmares pretty much from the age of like 6 up until I was a teenager, like, if you see something like this in your dream that's, you know, weird, don't go along with it. You know what? Actually, never go along with anything in your dream ever. No good can come of it. All you have to do is just kind of close your eyes in the dream and start thrashing, and you'll wake up and you'll be out of the nightmare.
Where's your pass? Screw your pass.
And then all of a sudden, she's not even in the school anymore. You ever have that happen in a dream where you're just in one place and then all of a sudden, with no explanation, you're somewhere else? I had this weird dream that I was taking the streetcar, and when I got off, I was in Australia, but I don't know what Australia really looks like, so like it was basically just Coxwell and Gerard with slightly different weather. It's like my brain was filling in the blanks with places that I am familiar with, but in my dream, it was Australia. One of the main reasons that this first dream sequence is one of my favorite scenes in the entire franchise is just how they shoot it. Like, you got Freddy slowly chasing Nancy down in the boiler room. Nancy is frantically freaking out, but Freddy is just completely calm. They contrast each other and it makes it extra creepy. It's as if Freddy knows that she isn't going anywhere and wishes to savor the kill. This is all supplemented with the camera work and the editing being jumpy, as well as the intense score by Charles Bernstein. I absolutely love this scene. I think this is the scene, like, if you're going to show somebody a clip from A Nightmare on Elm Street, you'll probably show them this scene and then the death that happens later in the movie.
Come to Freddy.
Now, one of the most important aspects of creating a fantasy world is to establish rules. If there were no rules to the dream world in the series, there would never really be any hope for the characters to actually beat the threat, and Nancy quickly learns, much like Tina did earlier, that if you get hurt in the dream world, you're gonna get hurt for real.
You die in the game, you die for real.
When she burns her arm on a pipe to wake herself up, she actually has the burn in the real world, and when her mother takes her to a sleep clinic to figure out what the hell is going on, she manages to pull Freddy's hat from the dream world into the real world. So the rules thus far of the dream world are pretty simple, especially compared to what they would become later. You die in the dream, you die for real.
You die in the game, you die for real.
You can get hurt, but you can bring shit out from your dream if you wake up while holding it. I really like the scene of Nancy in the sleep clinic. It's pretty effective. Heather Langenkamp herself said that she based her performance off the hospital scene from the first Exorcist. We don't even really get to see the dream. We know what the dream is. We just hear some of the noises and see her EEG meter going crazy while she looks uncomfortable in bed. And despite pulling out fucking Freddy Krueger's honest-to-God hat from the dream, all of this is chalked up to trauma and a deteriorating mental state, as Nancy's best friend was murdered, and then her best friend's boyfriend was apprehended in front of her for the murder before being found hanging in his cell by his neck. So really, there's even more working against her when she's trying to tell her parents, yes, there's a guy trying to kill me in my dream. When I look at this movie, I find the small cast works both for and against the movie, because typically when you go into a slasher movie, you think they're gonna just stack bodies, but really there aren't that many deaths in this movie. It's more so about building suspense and showing horror imagery through the nightmare sequences. And it does this relatively well. The jump scares don't really get me anymore, but there are some decent ones in here.
It's just a dream. This isn't real. This is just a dream. He isn't real. He isn't real.
But if you're like me and you came into this movie after watching some of the later ones, you might be a little let down by how it's more about following Nancy's descent into this whole ugly situation, and more about the suspense aspect than it is about the killing. And to be fair, while Heather Langenkamp delivers a great performance in this movie, the rest of the cast, besides Johnny Depp obviously, and maybe John Saxon, are very hit or miss. I really don't care for Ronnie Blakely. I think she kind of sucks in this movie. Rod and Tina are gone in the first half hour, and they're played by Amanda Wyss and Nikki Corey respectively, and you know, I look at them and they seem very much like horror actors. They can like play to the camera and they can act, but they're not very good at it. It's safe to say that Johnny Depp was able to stand out in this movie and show why he was one of the few people to come out of this movie with a career, because his acting seems like it's just a step above everybody else's. Although I do like Heather Langenkamp. I think she's a decent actress. I think she got unfairly thrown into the horror thing after this, because she probably could have done a lot more. And eventually Nancy finds out who Freddy Krueger is.
It even has his name written in it. Fred Krueger, Mom. Fred Krueger.
Of course, in this movie, he's only referred to as Fred Krueger, but nevertheless, Nancy's mother explains that several years prior to the events of the film, there was a child killer in the neighborhood who killed like 20 kids, and eventually he was caught and killed by the townsfolk, something that was covered up by the police department. This whole origin story gets expanded upon in later movies, including that when Freddy was arrested, somebody fucked up his arrest warrant and he got released on a technicality. But yeah, the origin story was kept very simple. He was killed by the townspeople as revenge for killing kids, and now he's back in their kids' dreams to kill again. There are two pieces of the origin story that ended up on the cutting room floor. The first part was that initially when they wrote this movie, Freddy was going to be a full-on child molester. This is something that still kind of actually remains in some capacity throughout the series, but it's more so on the subtle and implied side of things, and they felt it was better to downplay this so as not to seem like they were exploiting a very real issue in the world. Something they probably should have taken notes on when they did the stupid remake, but throughout the original series, you can watch it and you notice there's a somewhat aggressive sexual tone to Freddy Krueger. It's just very well hidden underneath creepy performances and cheesy one-liners.
He's a molester! He's a child molester! Ah!
Another piece of the origin story that was dropped, but I think they actually shot some of this, was that initially it was going to be revealed that Nancy and the other Elm Street kids had older siblings that were the original victims of Freddy. They would have been too young to really remember, but the parents would have covered it up, but for some reason or another they decided to drop this plot point, and yeah, I mean, it was a neat idea, but the movie works without it.
Glenn, Rod, Tina. They all had a brother or sister once. You too, Nancy.
After days of being tormented in her dreams by Freddy, Nancy eventually bucks up and realizes that if she can pull Freddy's hat out of the dream, she can pull him out, and we get a pretty awesome final showdown. It's kinda like Home Alone, but not as funny. Just before this, Glenn explains that in Balinese culture, they have control over their dreams, an early hint of the dream powers dynamic that would become common in the series later on. Basically, instead of panicking in a bad dream, the Balinese become aware and take control of the dream, so this is kind of a Chekhov's gun skill that comes into play when Nancy decides to bring Freddy out. Initially, she plans to have Glenn meet her on the porch with Freddy, but that plan doesn't really happen since Nancy's mother locks it from the inside and hides the key, and Glenn gets one of the most glorious deaths in the series. For as tame as this movie is, at least on the side of graphic violence, Johnny Depp getting pulled into his bed and spat out with way more blood than the human body could possibly contain is one of the defining moments of the entire franchise. You could say it's the second worst thing to ever happen to a bed that Johnny Depp was sleeping in because, you know, Amber Heard shit in his bed. It was one of the few things to actually shock me in this movie when I was a kid. It's so fucking brutal, and then when the cops show up, the way they sell it is just perfect.
You don't need a stretcher up there, you need a mop.
I love the commentary the cops have because of just how bizarre and disgusting this death is.
What's the coroner got to say? He's in the jaw and puking since he saw it.
Like, bro, the kid's parents are right there, and you're just talking about how gruesome and disgusting this kid's death was. Like... The final showdown between Nancy and Freddy I find is a bit anticlimactic. Sure, it has a great jump scare where Nancy thinks the pulling him in part didn't take.
I'm crazy after all.
And then there's a little game of cat and mouse that they play where Nancy uses her Macaulay Culkin skills to give her an advantage. But she sets him on fire and we see like the most like unconvincing fire suit in cinema history. And then all of a sudden, you know, her dad's there, her mom dies, and then it's all over. All because Nancy did what the Balinese would have done and chooses to simply not even acknowledge Freddy's existence, which takes away his power and causes him to die. The ending of this movie is just really bizarre and confusing, and I think if it was a standalone movie it would have made a lot more sense, but considering it ended up having sequels, it's just kind of dumb. Before Nancy gets rid of Freddy, she says that she wants her friends back, and then when she wakes up from the nightmare, her friends are back, but then it's still a nightmare and Freddy kills Nancy's mom. Or rather, kills the dummy of Nancy's mom. I've read a few interpretations of what this scene actually is. Like, originally this was supposed to have a happy ending, but the studio pressured Wes Craven to leave it with a sequel hook. I've heard one theory that this whole thing is just Freddy using the last little bit of his powers to fuck with Nancy one last time. I've heard some people say that if you ignore the sequels, the whole movie is a dream sequence and Nancy never woke up. I think the most logical explanation is that this whole thing was Nancy's mother's dream, as she is confirmed to be dead in the third movie. A Nightmare on Elm Street 1, I mean, I should just call it a Nightmare on Elm Street, but the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie is weird because it is of a very high quality and it's definitely one of the best first installments in an 80s slasher movie, but I find its age is starting to show and certain aspects of the movie live in the shadows of its more recent and exciting installments. For one, I find the movie is slow, and slow isn't always bad in horror, but it does have pacing issues. What we basically open up with in the first 20 minutes of the movie is the end of Tina's story in the universe. As a result, a lot of stuff happens in the first 20 minutes, such as Tina's death, and then later Rod's death, and then we have to reset because we're officially following Nancy. And Nancy gets a whole build-up with some pretty creative dream sequences, but when the movie slows down, it really slows down, and it kinda hurts the overall pacing of the movie. And then it just kind of abruptly crashes into the finish line for the final act. I will say that the positives of A Nightmare on Elm Street definitely outweigh the negatives, because despite being a little bit slow, the suspense it builds is pretty solid, and it kind of makes me sad that I knew what the movie was going to be going into it when I first watched it, because I had watched some of the sequels before it. I'll get a little bit more into that, you know, shortly in the video, but all I have to say is A Nightmare on Elm Street is a ride, it's a mystery, but its reputation kind of ruins it for future generations. That being that now, 40 years after the movie was released, everybody knows what it is, even if they haven't seen it. As for the character of Freddy Krueger, this was before he was the wisecracking comedian comedian he'd become when the series became a huge franchise, and Robert Englund is fucking creepy as shit. He's menacing, he's slimy, he's weird, and the makeup actually looked a little bit different from what it would become in the sequels. He looks more human, but also more like a monster than he would look like. I would say he definitely looks more scary in the first movie, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they really keep him in the shadows. You never really get a good look at his face or anything. I think one of the most important rules in horror regarding the monster is that you want to show the monster, but you don't want to show the monster too much. And the first Nightmare on Elm Street does a very good job following this rule. However, the monster is only as scary as the actor portraying the monster can make him, and Robert Englund is so good at playing Freddy Krueger. I've mentioned that the movie has like a sexually aggressive tone to it in the way that Freddy attacks women, but Robert Englund's overall demeanor, even when he's not talking, even though they dropped the whole child molester thing from this movie, it just comes off that he's some sort of sex predator slash murderer. Robert Englund himself has like a very creepy look like outside of makeup, but put him in that Freddy makeup and he looks genuinely disturbing. But I think one of the most effective traits that this movie has, something that they don't really use in later Nightmare on Elm Street movies, is Freddy's voice. Most people associate Freddy with having that deep voice that he always has. Welcome to prime time, bitch! He doesn't really have that in this movie. He has like a deep voice that he uses that's more demonic and evil sounding, but then he also has this like high-pitched scratchy voice he uses. Having his voice change pitch and all that kind of just adds to the whole nightmarish feeling that the dream sequences have, because that is something that you would encounter in a dream. Just like an inconsistent kind of tone of voice for whatever the subject of your nightmare is. With this, he literally seems like something out of a fucking nightmare. Freddy is unsettling as shit in this movie. Okay, so as I mentioned a few paragraphs ago, knowing about the movie kind of ruins the experience of the movie, and that's why my review of this isn't as glaringly positive as, say, my Saw review. When I was a kid, I knew about Freddy because my dad grew up watching these movies, and when Treehouse of Horror 6 aired, he explained that the Groundskeeper Willie segment was a parody of a movie called A Nightmare on Elm Street. But I didn't start watching 80s slasher movies until I was about 12 or 13 years old. I got into it during the build-up to the release of Freddy vs. Jason in the summer of 2003. I remember my cousins rented some of the sequels to Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, but I didn't actually see the first Nightmare on Elm Street until after I saw Freddy vs. Jason. I knew the story, I'd seen the Dream Warriors, so I knew who Nancy was, and I was familiar with some of the scenes from A Nightmare on Elm Street, but for the most part, the first movie evaded me until long after the Freddy vs. Jason craze was dying down. Keep in mind, we didn't have streaming services, and I didn't have a membership to any rental places, and I doubt my parents would have rented this movie for me back then. The Freddy vs. Jason build-up started as I was going from grade 6 to grade 7, so when school started that year in 2003, a lot of kids were talking about these movies, as well as the crossover that came out that summer. Furthermore, my school was one of the few schools that went all the way up to grade 8 in my neighborhood, so I was meeting a lot of new kids from other schools who were transferring into my school for 7th and 8th grade, and as a result I was making new friends, and one of these friends was this kid named Jordan, who just so happened to be into these movies too. And we were talking, and basically he was like, yeah, I have the first movie if you want to borrow it, because I had never seen it. So he loaned me the VHS, and despite knowing what I was getting into, having seen the other movies, I enjoyed it, but my young brain was just like, it's kind of boring and nothing really happens. Because I was 12, 13 and didn't have the mental development to really absorb atmosphere and enjoy suspense, and I already knew that Nancy was gonna live because she was in the Dream Warriors. In retrospect, yeah, this is the most well-made Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but I didn't really have that first viewing experience that I would have wanted to have with it. Eventually, this Jordan kid told me to just keep the tape, and unfortunately I had a house fire a few years later and the tape was destroyed. It was like the original 1980s clamshell release. It was a neat tape to have. I always remember the story because that Jordan kid was like the first new friend I made in middle school, and then he moved away before the end of the year. And the last time I ever heard anything about this kid, I learned just through somebody who happened to have lived in the same town that he moved to that transferred into my high school, that he was hit and killed by a van while walking along a road at night. Rest in peace, Jordan. But honestly, in terms of cohesiveness, this is probably the best Nightmare on Elm Street movie because it tells a story, it has characters that are developed, and it didn't really jump any sharks. It was legitimately unsettling and creepy, and after 40 years, people still know the name Fred Krueger. The reputation and legacy of A Nightmare on Elm Street is so strong, and the movies are still referenced today in pop culture. It's a damn shame that when they had the chance to remake this movie using modern technology and a bigger budget, that they made the second worst horror remake of all time. But that's a video for another day, it, and all I have to say now is happy 40th birthday, Freddy. So that concludes the Halloween video dump for this year. You know, there was a lot of Milestone anniversaries that I had to talk about, and there's even more that I couldn't even get to, and I was able to round it out by doing a video that I bailed on a few months ago. And all in all, I would have to say that this has been a pretty good spooky season thus far. But next month is the month of November. It's the month of my birth, so keep an eye out for some reviews of movies and shows that I have a close connection to, because November is officially Auto Month on this channel. If you like this video, drop me a like, subscribe, and share me with your friends, and I've been glad to rake your acquaintance. See you next time.
Come to Freddy.
Little